This lecture is going to cover the topics of intermolecular forces of attraction, and by the end of this lecture, you should have an idea of the types of intermolecular forces of attraction present between atoms, molecules, and ions, and also, given a molecule, be able to determine which of those intermolecular forces of attraction would be present. So some definitions to start. So intermolecular forces of attraction, when we look at that word, inter means between. So these are forces of attraction between multiple molecules. When we think about IMFs, these are responsible for many physical properties, including the boiling point, melting point, surface tension, and viscosity of molecules, and more. And in general, when we think about this, the stronger the force of attraction between molecules, the more difficult it is to separate them. Another way of thinking about that is the stronger the IMFs present, the higher the boiling point of that molecule, the more energy we would have to put in to turn this from a liquid to a gas. There's three types of IMFs that we're going to go over, and shown here in blue. The first is dipole-dipole interactions, and we'll look at a subset called ion dipole, London dispersion forces, and then hydrogen bonding. So first we can talk about dipole-dipole. Um, Dipole-dipole forces, intermolecular forces of attraction, are attractive forces between polar molecules. And this is when the opposite poles of a molecule will be attracted to one another. As a reminder, a polar molecule is a molecule in which the center of positive and negative charge are at different locations or poles. And we can determine whether a molecule is polar through experiment, but at this point we should also be able to do it by drawing the Lewis structure, identifying any bond dipoles, and then determining if the overall structure is polar or nonpolar. So within these dipole-dipole intermolecular forces of attraction, we can see what this really is an attractive force between the partial positive on one molecule and the partial negative on another molecule. So anytime we have polar molecules, they would exhibit dipole-dipole intermolecular forces of attraction between each other. A subset of this is what's known as ion dipole interactions, and in these we have substituted one of the polar molecules for an ion instead. And so it's an interaction between an ion, either positive or negatively charged, and a polar molecule. We see this a lot with salts or ionic solids. Salts and ionic solids will dissolve in a polar solvent because of these ion dipole interactions. And we can start to see that shown on the picture on the right, where we have our image of our ionic solid, which is a crystal lattice of this negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive ions. And you can start to see the arrangement of water molecules around those ions. And we'll zoom in on that, and we can look at what's happening when those ions dissolve. And you can see on the left, you have a positively charged cation, and that is surrounded by water molecules. And pay attention to the orientation of the water molecules, where the negative end, the oxygen, is pointed towards the positive cation. On the right, we have our anion, negatively charged ion, and now the water molecules are surrounding it, but now the hydrogens, or the positive end of water, is pointed toward the negatively charged ion. So these would be the ion dipole interactions that we see here. So our second type of intermolecular force of attraction is what's known as London dispersion forces. London dispersion forces are known by a few different names. They could be called just dispersion forces, London dispersion forces, or induced dipole forces, as we'll see. A couple things to know is, first of all, every molecule has London dispersion forces. These forces of attraction are temporary dipoles in the molecules. So what's happening here is, over the surface of the molecules, we have brief movement of electrons over the surface that creates a very tiny positive and a very tiny negative site on the molecule. These tiny positive and tiny negative partial charges can then interact with a second molecule and form these small forces of attraction. These induced attractions are short-lived. They're constantly coming and going, and they're pretty small, but on the whole, when you add them together, they end up being quite a large force of attraction. So we can see a couple pictures of some polar molecules and what's going on. On the left, you see the polar molecules, and on the right, you see these sort of induced dipole moments. A better illustration is this little animation. So we're going to start off, and you can see the green nonpolar molecule, and when I play this, you will start to see regions of blue and red representing the positive and negative charges, and then other molecules will come in, and we'll see how the partial positive and partial negative of one molecule can induce this in a second molecule. So here we go, you can see small positive and negative charges, other molecules come in, and you start to see these brief, constantly moving forces of attraction between the various molecules. These are the London dispersion forces, right? And these come about through the electrons on the surface of the molecule. So then our last intermolecular force of attraction is hydrogen bonding. This is the strongest of our intermolecular force of attraction, although still much weaker than covalent bonds. These can be thought of as super strength dipole-dipole interactions. And we need a couple of criteria to be true in order to have these. These hydrogen bonds are an interaction between a hydrogen that has to be covalently bonded to an electronegative element such as nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine, and a lone pair of electrons on a different highly electronegative element, nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. So we can look at some pictures and some examples, and shown here we have two different hydrogen bonding interactions. On the left is the hydrogen bonding interactions within water. So two different water molecules coming together, and you can see we have a hydrogen covalently bonded to an oxygen, and then the hydrogen bond is from that hydrogen to a lone pair on a different oxygen. On the right, we have water interacting with ammonia, NH3, and so we have the hydrogen on water forming an intermolecular force of attraction, a hydrogen bond, to a lone pair located on nitrogen. Now that we know the definitions of the types of IMFs, what we should be able to do is identify what IMFs would be present in a pure substance given the Lewis structure. So here we have two Lewis structures, butane and acetone, and we should be able to say which of those three IMFs are present in each of these molecules. So we'll take butane first, the structure on the left, and remember, all molecules have London dispersion forces, so we can say butane's going to have London dispersion forces. And then we can ask ourselves, does it have dipole-dipole, and does it have hydrogen bonding? In order to have dipole-dipole, it would have to be a polar molecule, but when we look at it, the only bonds present are carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds. Both are nonpolar, and so it's no dipole-dipole, and then therefore also no hydrogen bond. So this has only London dispersion forces. On the right we have acetone. Now acetone has carbon and hydrogen bonds, but it also has that C double bond O. So that C double bond O represents a polar bond. So this would be a polar molecule, and once we identify it to be polar, we can say it is going to have London dispersion forces and dipole-dipole interactions. However, it has no hydrogen bonding capability because there's no hydrogen bound to an oxygen, nitrogen, or fluorine. Thank you.